Okay, welcome everyone. I'm Barbara Slavin. I direct the Middle East Perspectives Project here at the Stimson Center. I'm really delighted to welcome all of you here in person and those of you who are joining us online. We have a special treat today. I'm very, very honored that we have Mohsen Milani, one of the preeminent scholars on Iran and its foreign and security policy, visiting us here at Stimson. I've known him for more than a decade. We were reminiscing about when we first encountered each other, and we've collaborated in the past. We did a program on the 40th anniversary of the Iranian Revolution together at the Atlantic Council, and I've been invited many times down to the University of South Florida and various associated think tanks, so it's really a pleasure. He's been a kind of mentor to me, if that's fair to say, and also to some of our contributors to Middle East Perspectives, including Sina Azodi, who's here, Arman Mahmoudian, who's written for us. So he's an all-around great guy. But he has written a new book called Iran's Rise and Rivalry with the U.S. in the Middle East. We're going to talk about that. You have his bio, but just briefly, he's professor of politics and director of the Center for Strategic and Diplomatic Studies at the University of South Florida. He's been a research fellow at Harvard, Oxford, and how do you pronounce it? Ca' Foscari University in Italy. He's also written a seminal book, The Making of Iran's Islamic Revolution, From Monarchy to Islamic Republic, prior to this new book. Before we get started, I want to remind people we will have time for questions, and for those who are watching online, you can go to stimson.org/questions to put in your questions, which I will be able to read here. Also, for those who would like to hang around the neighborhood, we have another fantastic event at 3:30 today from our Strategic Foresight program on the world to come, Trump and the New World Order. And given the news of today, I can't imagine a more timely program. So, your new book, Mohsen, explores the origins and strategic logic behind Iran's policies toward the U.S., Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, and the Palestinians. So we don't have very much to talk about, do we? I'm going to ask you a few questions that are related to your book, and then obviously we're going to go to the current situation where once again, we seem poised between war and peace with Iran, as we have been so many times in the past. But what I loved about your book, I mean, even for those who know the history, you put the pieces down in such a way that the puzzle sort of emerges. And I noticed in particular a couple of things that I think are really important to point out. You noted that Britain carved out the state of Iraq in the Middle East from the remnants of the Ottoman Empire shortly after World War I. And it did this without consulting the giant country next door, Iran. It also backed a coup by the army officer Reza Khan, who became the first Shah of the modern era in Iran. And it did this 6 months before it installed the Hashemite king Hussein in Iraq. So the Brits essentially were the hegemon, and they were creating a new order in the Middle East in the aftermath of World War I in a way that I think a lot of people don't understand. So what I'd like you to reflect on is how this long history of Iran essentially being manipulated or ignored by foreign powers affects its mentality as it looks at the world today, affects its views of major powers, bigger powers that have played such a role in its history. How does this history figure in Iranian policy today, and what is it that Iran wants from the big powers?
Well,
Small question.
Thank you very much, Barbara, for your kind introduction. I also have to say that you are one of the few American journalists who actually have gone to Iran and who knows a great deal about the Iranian culture, about Iranian history, because one of the fundamental problems I see with many people who claim to be an expert on Iran or people who make policies, they are clueless about the history of Iran as well as the culture of Iran. And this lack of knowledge about culture, I think, has created major problems for the US, not only in Iran, but also in Iraq after the invasion of that country. So it is an honor to be with you, and I admire your work, and I have been following your work as well, and it has had a great deal of impact. And by the way, we don't invite anybody to come to Tampa, Florida. You have to have good credential, and I see Mark right there being another person who has been to our university, and so it is a great honor to be with you. Your question, let me, there are two parts to your question. One is about what impact has the British and following this American policies toward Iran has had on the political culture and mentality of Iran. I think there are two issues that are crucial to understanding Iran's policy today, during the Shah's days, and years later. One is this, what I call imperial ambition. Iran has been a major power for at least 800, 900 years as a major global power, and then for many, many centuries, a major regional power. So intervening in the region to push its agenda, to protect its interests is nothing new. Yeah. And one of the key conclusions of the book is that regardless of what kind of system we have in Iran, whether it is democratic or undemocratic, totalitarian or theocratic or imperial, there are certain things that Iran is going to do. This is why in every chapter of the book, the first 15 pages, 10 or 15 pages, is dedicated to explaining Iranian policy under the Shah, because I wanted to show patterns of continuity and change. The second aspect for Iran, to understand Iran, is this sense of insecurity that Iran has had. I would say since the war of Iran's war with Russia, around between 1812 to 1822, in which Iran lost about 20% of its territory to Imperial Russia. And from that moment until today, there has been a sense of insecurity that the great powers are determined to divide Iran and prevent Iran from emerging a major power. And that insecurity is the key to understanding what Iran is doing today. Don't forget, Iran declared its neutrality in World War I. Everybody ignored it. Iran declared its neutrality in World War II. Everyone ignored it. And we have had clear cases of foreign intervention in Iranian policy. So when you look at Iran's policy in the region, you have to understand that part of that policy is to protect the survival of the Islamic Republic, to protect Iranian interests. See, I am of the opinion that in international politics, three things rule. They govern: pursuit of power, and P, security, protection of country's security, and interest. I call it PSI. PSI determines how every country operates, regardless of your political system. So this idea that if we overthrow the Islamic Republic tomorrow, there is going to be a regime that is not going to intervene in the region, it's delusional. The Shah intervened in Oman. The Shah intervened in the civil war in Yemen. The Shah intervened in Lebanon by helping the late Imam Musa Saad, a really moderate and progressive cleric, who also created Amal, from which Hezbollah emerged. So this idea has to be put aside. So these two issues, the ambition to become a major power and the insecurity Iran has shaped Iranian policy for the past 40 years.
Yeah. Some of the other things in your book I just wanted to mention because they're just, I didn't know, or I didn't focus on it in the proper way, that the Hausa in Najaf, the most important Shia learning center in the world, was founded by a Persian theologian in the 11th century. The connections between Iran and Iraq that currently the Trump administration is trying to get the Iraqi government to distance itself from Iran. You can't distance yourself from a country that you've been intertwined with in one way or another for so many centuries. I thought that was fascinating. The other that, as we know, there was a war between Iran and Iraq in the 1980s, and the first Iraqi Shia group that Iran supported after the Iraqi invasion was a group called Dawa,
Yes.
which was founded decades before the Islamic Revolution, even though it influenced Ayatollah Khomeini when he led the revolution. So again, the connections back and forth, this sort of cross-fertilization of ideas. And then you mentioned Lebanon, going back and looking at sort of the origins of what became the axis of resistance, which we'll talk about in a minute. These groups that Iran has supported in the Middle East that the U.S. refers to as proxies that have been opposed to Israel and so on. The way all of this began, you mentioned the Imam Musa Sadr, very famous religious figure, Iranian religious figure, who went to Lebanon from Iran in 1959. But he fell out with the Shah. And he was important at a period when the Shah of Iran was trying to fight against Arab radicalism, Nasserism. And that was actually more important to the Shah than a lot of people recognize. After Nasser died and Sadat became the president of Egypt, the Shah stopped supporting the Imam Musa Sadr because he no longer needed him. And so Sadr went on to sort of radicalize the Shia in Lebanon, but that was not really the Shah's idea, was it? So sometimes you have individuals or groups that you may support, and this is true under the Shah, and it's true now, and yet they go their own way. They don't obey orders.
Again, part of the problem I see with some of the analysis about Iran and its regional policy is that people do not pay enough attention to the history of the Middle East, modern history of the Middle East. For us in America, everything starts at the moment when we don't like something. Anything that happened before that is irrelevant. But for us academics, what happens today is the continuation of what has happened in the past. Of course, you don't have to go 10,000 years early, but there are relevant, important points about history that can help you understand. The point about Lebanon is that in 1501, when Shiism became the dominant religion in Iran, 12-but Shiism became the dominant religion in Iran, the majority of Iranians were Sunnis.
Right.
And because Shah Ismail Safavi, by the way, a 14-year-old kid, because he wanted to revive the Persian Empire again, and the Ottomans were the main obstacle, he pushed for imposition of 12-but Shiism. The problem was that they didn't have enough clerics who lived in Iran. So what did? They went to two areas, axis of resistance, two areas, southern Lebanon and southern Iraq. Yeah. And a large number of clerics then were moved to Iran. It was a deal made in heaven. The Safavid king promised the clerics protection from Ottoman persecution. They promised them wealth, important jobs in government, and in return, these clerics provided legitimacy to the institution of monarchy, which has been the basis until 1979. Religious institutions provided the legitimacy to the institution of monarchy. The same thing in southern Iraq. So that connection that you see today can go back hundreds of years, and it is natural for Iran to expand its influence.
In 2008, I wrote a monograph for the U.S. Institute of Peace about Iranian regional influence, and I went...
Rest in peace.
I went to Iran, I went to Qum, I went to the library of Shahristani's library. And I was given a family tree of the Sadr family that showed the branches in Iran, Iraq, and Lebanon.
Yes.
And you go back centuries, as you say, and you see how they all intermarried and so on. And again, without knowing this, you can't understand the connections there. One other historical thing I'm going to bring up, and then we'll move to the sort of present, and that has to do with Iran-Syria relations, which everybody talks about how Syria became Iran's closest ally in the Arab world after the 1979 revolution. But again, these ties predate. You point out that Hafez al-Assad sent his prime minister to visit Iran in 1973. The Shah gave medical treatment in Tehran to Syrians injured in the 1973 Yom Kippur War. Assad himself went to Tehran in 1975. He got money from the Shah. Assad was worried about Iran-Iraq rapprochement, and he wanted the Shah to help him get back the Golan Heights. So those who think that this relationship just came out of nowhere during the Iran-Iraq War need to know that the Shah of Iran was not as pro-Israel as he was billed. In fact, Iran voted for the Zionism is a form of racism resolution at the UN General Assembly in 1975. And the Shah criticized AIPAC, the pro-Israel lobby in the United States. So the nuances that get lost in conversations about a country as complicated and old as Iran, the list is long. So our time is limited. Let's pivot a little bit to the current situation. Your book was written before all the blows that these Iran-affiliated groups have suffered since October 7th of 2023. But you're very prescient. You foreshadow this by saying that the axis of resistance, gained strength after the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. It rose, it reached its pinnacle. Then the U.S. under Trump 1 killed Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Quds Force. And you predict that this axis of resistance is already going to be diminished and that Iran's policy of sort of pitting its security on this axis is a flawed strategy that's not sustainable. So tell me how you came to this conclusion before October 7th, 2023, and where you see this going now.
If you don't mind, I just want to make one point about the issue of Syria and
Sure.
the point that you made. And that is, the Shah had not antagonistic, but unfriendly relations towards Syria until Hafez al-Assad staged a coup and became president of Syria. And at that time, one of the key elements, I think one of the key persons who helped Iran develop a much closer relationship to Syria was Imam Musa Sadr, who was a very close friend, personal friend of Assad. And one of the things that Musa Sadr, along with another major clerics, did is to recognize the Alawites as a legitimate branch of Shia Islam. Yeah. Because these poor Alawites have been persecuted and prosecuted by Sunni majority for thousands of years. And it was from that moment that Iran moved closer to Syria, partly because of what I said, partly because Assad was gone, and also partly because the Shah was beginning to have bigger ambitions. His bigger ambitions was to become a dominant force in the Middle East. And he knew, based on what his friend Anwar Sadat had told him, that if you want to become a dominant power, you have to end your conflict with Iraq, which he did in 1975, and you have to move toward the more moderate Iraqi Arab elements. And he did precisely that. And before the revolution, by the way, Hafez al-Assad goes to Iran, meets with the Shah, and he gets quite a bit of money from the Shah. Now, going to the main question you asked about Iran's rise. Yes, you're right. I like to take some credit for being able to say two things that are not very popular in Washington. One is that I said Iran has become a major power. And I think I showed in this book how this came about, despite the American policy of containing Iran. And I go in country by country and show how this became possible. And one of the key elements, one of the key points I make is that why Iran had developed the infrastructure to become a major regional power, but it was the American invasion of Iraq that became a catalyst, allowing Iran to expand its influence, because based on the Ottoman model, a Sunni-dominated Iraq, even if Iraq is a Shia majority country, but for the Ottomans and for the British after 1921, Iraq was always regarded as a fortress to prevent Iran from expanding its influence in the Levant as well as in Arabian Peninsula. And once Saddam Hussein regime was destroyed, that fortress collapsed and Iran was able to expand its influence there. So I think the decisive moment, the key moment for the beginning of the decline of Iranian power is when Qasem Soleimani was killed. I say it's a decisive moment because I believe that individuals often play a much more important role in creating networks, in establishing political parties than it's usually given credit to. Qasem Soleimani, since he became the commander of the Quds Force, was the glue that kept that axis of resistance together. He knew everybody. And he was unlike the current leader of the Quds Force. He would go to the battlefield. He would pray with his supporters. And I'm not saying that in support of him. I'm just describing the kind of leader he was. And once he was killed, I think this is the beginning of the decline. And then what happened after October 7th, when Hamas committed blatant acts of terrorism, unjustified acts of terrorism against Israel. And by doing this, not only hurt themselves, I think they caused the beginning of the decline of the axis of resistance and have created the kind of mess we have. They have no one to blame but themselves for making that idiotic move against Israelis, killing 1,250 people, and they're still paying the price for it. So in my book, I essentially said Iran's rise is unbelievable. It's unique after World War II, but it is not something that can be sustained. And I came out with a number of reasons. One of the reasons I said is because Iran is spending too much money and not getting anything in return, because everything Iran does is security-based, not economic-based. And it was draining the Iranian treasure. Number two, I said, in a world dominated by powerful states, Iranian reliance on non-state actors is unsustainable. Number three, I said, the fundamental problem of Iranian regional policy, the fundamental problem of Iranian foreign policy since 1979, since the hostage crisis, when 500 delusional, despicable characters attacked the American embassy and created this sort of Cold War between Iran and the United States. The fundamental flaw is this: Iran does not have the capability, does not have the power to confront the United States and win this Cold War. Not only it cannot win the Cold War, it will lose the Cold War. And I said this is the problem with Iranian foreign policy. Its ambitions does not match its capability. Its ambition is far more powerful than its capability. And finally, I make this point that I think, Barbara, you would like. There is a section in the book that says, the title of it, "The Shah was powerful abroad, but vulnerable at home." When the 1979 revolution happened, and I wrote my first book about why we had that incredible revolution in Iran, exactly in the decade when Iranian economic growth remains unprecedented in modern history of Iran. The Shah was a powerful man, not only in the Persian Gulf because of President Richard Nixon's policy. By the way, I admire that man. Because of what he had done supporting the Shah. Not only he had become a powerful man in the Persian Gulf, but he was also a powerful man in the Middle East. I would say, if not one of the top two most powerful figure in the Middle East. And yet, exactly at the height of Iranian power, the revolution took place. Why? Because internally, the Shah was beginning to lose his legitimacy. Today, we are seeing the same thing taking place in Iran. We have a young, new generation of Iranian youth, well connected to the global system, electronically savvy, that do not understand the logic of the Islamic Republic. And unless the Islamic Republic can address that issue domestically, they're going to face critical, fundamentally dangerous situation in the years to come.
Wow. Well, that tees up the obvious questions about where we are now in terms of U.S.-Iran relations. We've all seen in the last couple of weeks, there's been an exchange of letters between President Trump and Ayatollah Khamenei. There was a discussion about the Iranians agreeing to indirect talks. My friend Laura Rosen, who maybe is online watching, wrote today on her Substack that Iran has actually said it would agree to direct negotiations with the U.S. if indirect talks, probably in Oman, go well. At the same time, Trump has threatened to bomb Iran like it's never been bombed before. There have been really bellicose threats from particularly some of his National Security Council establishment. There have been softer words from Steve Witkoff, who I'm calling his envoy for everything. How do you see the dynamic now between an Iran that is weak, weaker regionally than it's been in a long time, and certainly weaker domestically, and a re-energized President Trump who is doing drastic things all over the place?
Yeah. If you remember when I was talking about Qasem Soleimani, I said I emphasize the character of leaders. For me, President Trump is not a warmonger. I think he wants to have, that's my personal view based on observing his behavior and his policies. I don't think he wants war. I think he wants to have a different kind of agreement than the JCPOA. But of course, there is a faction in his administration that sees Iran in a very different, and I think, wrong way. The perception is that Iran has reached the peak of its vulnerability since 1979. No, it's not. There is nothing, no evidence, not a shred of evidence that suggests Iran is the peak of its vulnerability. Yes, Iran has been weakened in the region. Hezbollah has been weakened, but Hezbollah is not out. Don't forget, Hezbollah still can mobilize considerable number of Shiites and still can engage in acts of terrorism. Its military capabilities have been diminished, its organization has been infiltrated, but it can come back. And you cannot destroy an organization that's popular base of support. Now, the case of Assad is different. I have argued, and I believe it, that the fall of Assad is the single greatest strategic defeat for Iran since 1979. And it is, I compare what happened to Syria to what happened to Iran for the United States. The collapse of Assad was a strategic defeat for Iran, as the fall of the Shah was a strategic defeat for the United States of America. Yes, Iran has essentially lost Syria. Syria is out. And to be honest with you, I'm very happy that's the case, because Syria was just taking Iranian money, and there was absolutely no logic for continued Iranian support for Assad regime.
Well, to get weapons through to Hezbollah.
Yeah, but there were other ways they could do it in a much cheaper way. So those two are gone. Hamas has been completely weakened, but Hamas was never part of Iran's defense doctrine. It was in the periphery. It was not the heart of it. The heart of that, I think, was Hezbollah, Syria, and Iraq, and then followed by the Houthis. And in the last, I think it was Hamas. And by the way, it's the only non-Shia group in the axis of resistance. So that is gone. What is not gone are four things. A, the Houthis. B, the Iranian-backed militias in Iraq.
Yeah.
Number three, Iran today has been able to enrich uranium at 60%, which before had done at 20%. Iran today has much closer relations with Russia. And, and lastly, one of the key elements is that despite what the Western governments claim, that Iranian defense system has been completely destroyed or weakened, and Iranian missiles have been completely weakened. As a scholar, I like to see the evidence. Just because somebody says they have been destroyed, I think we have to be very careful about saying that Iran has become too vulnerable. And don't forget, attacking Iran is going to change the game. It's going to entirely change the game. This idea that we can go ahead and strike at number of nuclear facilities and expect Iran to raise the white flag, it's not going to happen that way. I don't think it's going to happen. I could be wrong, and I'll be more than happy to come back to you and say I was wrong. But I don't think it's going to happen for one simple reason. You know what that is?
No.
There is great deal of dissatisfaction with the Islamic Republic today. People say Iran of today is not like Iran of 1979, 1980, when Iraq invaded Iran. And they conclude that Iranians are not going to rally behind the flag. Part of this equation is right. There is a large segment of the Iranian population who is unhappy. How are they going to react if there is a serious attack on Iran and a lot of people are killed? I don't know. But here is what I do know. Ayatollah Khamenei does not rely on that segment of the population. He relies on his base, which is about 25% at most. 20% of 90 million people, a lot of people.
Yeah.
They're not going to go away.
Yeah. You know, I was guest lecturing for Sina the other day, and there always is a question, is the Iranian government going to fall? And the metric I always look at is, are there defections from the security services, from the deep state? Are we beginning to see, policemen refuse to fire on crowds when there are protests? And so far, we haven't seen that. Now, that's what happened before the 1979 revolution. You had thousands of members of the military defecting every day. You had police who would not fire on protesters. So until or unless one sees those kinds of cracks, people are really unhappy. The regime is really unpopular, but it's hard to see it suddenly fall.
And add one other element to it, and that is one of the my favorite graduate courses that I've been teaching for 25 years is comparative revolutionary movements, where I compare the French Revolution with the Russian Revolution, Chinese Revolution, and Iran, and occasionally with the Nicaraguan Revolution. And we talk about how revolutions come about. And one of the key elements of being able to stage a successful revolution today is having a leadership,
Yes.
cohesive leadership that has national support, and most importantly, can form an alliance with different segments of society against the established regime, and can also give great deal of hope to people that things are going to get better. Don't forget, the 1979 promised a lot and delivered not much.
And people remember that.
People remember that. Moreover, imagine you're a middle-class Iranian. You work all your life. On one hand, because of the valuation of rial, you're losing everything. On the other hand, you see Iraq, you see Syria, you see Lebanon. What conclusion can you draw? Are you willing to take a risk, even if you're unhappy? I was in Iran in 1979, 78, before the revolution. And there was pervasive dissatisfaction. But I can guarantee you that dissatisfaction today is 10 times more. 10 times more.
But no leader.
But not only no leader, no organization, and you have a government that is cohesive and is not going to be silent. When it is challenged, it uses force. Compare how Ayatollah Khamenei reacted to the recent event or to the 2009 Green Movement with the Shah of Iran. The Shah of Iran in either September or October of 1979 appeared on national television. And he said, look, I hear the voice of your revolution. This was the first time anyone was talking about revolution. He popularized that. And what was the conclusion everybody drew? The conclusion was this man can no longer use violence. He's unwilling to do it. Now,
contrast that with what we see today.
In the Green Movement, Ayatollah Khamenei delivered the Friday sermon. Turned to Rafsanjani, said, Mr. Rafsanjani, you're an old buddy of mine, but in this particular case, I'm sorry, I side with the president, Ahmadinejad. And then he said, from now on, you take to the streets, we are going to confront you. And that's it. Yeah. So you have a government like this, and you have an opposition that is disorganized and unable to provide a vision.
What is your theory of change, though? Because people who say there's a possibility for gradual change in Iran often get poo-pooed. When Ayatollah Khamenei dies, he's 85, I think,
86,
going in 86. Yeah. Will that trigger something? What is your theory of change?
I believe in gradual change. And the reason why I believe in it is because I have studied too many revolutions. And I have seen the price you pay is much higher than what you get. Yes, reform is slow. Reform might not satisfy everybody. But I tell you one thing, people who say this system cannot change.
Haven't been to Iran.
Haven't been to Iran yet. I encourage you to go. Or they haven't seen the videos of people being not veiled in major Iranian cities. Is that not change? Now, is that going to be the kind of change? Are we going to have a democratic, secular Iran by this process? Maybe not. But do you really think if we have a revolution and we overthrow this in this environment, in this region right now, we're going to have a democratic, secular Iran? What are you going to do with all these people who follow the Islamic Republic? What are you going to do with them? If you suppress them, then you can't speak of democracy. If you don't, they're going to start mobilizing against you. So I think you always have to look at the options you have and choose the least damaging option. Yes, it is going to be very easy for me, Barbara, and a lot of young Iranians are going to welcome it. If I say, yes, let's go, overthrow, change everything. But I went through the 1979 revolution, and I wasn't in favor of it. I saw what happened. Yeah. I don't want to go through another experience without knowing the end game. What is the exit? What is the end game? What are we changing this with? And what guarantee do we have that it's going to be better?
Two pillars of this system, apart from the hijab, which is, you point out, is going away. Anti-Americanism, and the other is anti-Israel. Again, reading your book, I discovered the connections between people who became Iranian revolutionaries and the Palestinian movement going way back. And that a lot of these radicals, I thought they all got their training from the PLO in Lebanon. Turns out a lot of them got their training in Egypt first, and then went to Lebanon, which I hadn't realized, including Mustafa Chamran.
Yes.
The Che Guevara, Iran's Che Guevara, as he's sometimes called, went on to become Minister of Defense after the revolution. So, death to Israel, death to America. Where are those going?
Well, let me start with Israel. I think, and I have said that, and I've said it in programs that were aired in Iran. This idea of Iran destroying the state of Israel is idiotic. Is absolutely idiotic. Iran has no right to call for destruction of another state, member of the United Nations. Number two, Iran doesn't have the damn capability to do that, even if they want to, and they shouldn't want this. How does Iran feel if another country says, we want to destroy you? So this idea is idiotic. It does not serve Iranian national interest. And the sooner Iran begins to change and modify this policy to put an end to this nonsense, the better it is for Iran. Now, how can they do that? Go along with what the majority of the Arab countries wants to do.
Sure.
Why do you want to act more Roman than Roman themselves? Yeah. Let the Arab countries decide, and you say whatever they decide, we'll go along with it, and stop providing weapons. Stop building tunnels. If you read the chapter on Hamas, I explain all of this. How Iran provided helped the building of these underground tunnels and everything else. So for me, they have to revise, change their policy toward Israel. Iran and Israel does not have any axe to grind against Iran. And Iran should not have been involved in this. In the chapter on Lebanon, I said that was the mistake Iran made. Get itself involved in the Arab-Israeli conflict. So that is out. Regarding the U.S., they have to revise that policy too. This anti-Americanism is nonsense. Large majority of Iranians want to have good, friendly relationship with the United States. Why is it that Iran is only one of the few countries in the world that doesn't have the relationship with the United States when Russia, Iran's ally, China, another Iran ally, they all have relationship with the U.S. What's wrong with that? What is wrong with having good relationship with Iran? So on both of these accounts, it must change.
Will it change under Khamenei?
No.
No.
But it could be modified under Khamenei. It could modify it because we are at a very dangerous juncture right now. I think change in Iran, change usually comes very quietly. If you look at the way they dealt with the veiling legislation to reimpose veiling, you see how they do it. They don't announce major changes. They do it slowly. And I hope they do. I really hope they revise, reevaluate their policy toward Israel because it has been counterproductive and it's wrong.
Yeah.
It's just wrong.
So, time is going very fast. So let me ask if anyone in the audience, yes, of course, Mark Katz. Do we have a mic? Yeah, wait for the mic. And again, I see that there are also a bunch of questions now all of a sudden that have come in online as well. So we'll try to take a couple of those too.
Thank you very much. Mark Katz from George Mason University. Great to have this presentation. I'm just wondering, you talked about the anti-Israeli rhetoric, and I'm just wondering, what is the purpose of this? In other words, if why say something if you can't actually bring it about? And I'm just sort of wondering, is it in fact, do they intend to bring about the destruction of Israel, or is it meant as a sort of positioning Iran in terms of what they term collaborationist Arab regime? You know, see, we are really anti-Israeli, whereas all of those Arab regimes really are not. We're serious. Is it an appeal to the Arab street, if you will, more than anything else? Because it seems to me that you know, otherwise, if they really mean it about Israel, then there's no point in saying it if they can't actually bring it about. But anyway, thank you.
One of the things, Mark, one of the interesting things about Iran is that right after the Balfour Declaration by the British promising a homeland for the Jews, there were demonstrations in major cities in Europe. And in these demonstrations, the picture of Cyrus the Great, the founder of the Persian Empire, was carried along with the picture of the Queen of England. And in other words, there is this historical tie between the Iranians and the Jews. Cyrus was the liberator of the Jews. And I think even during the Shah's days, the Shah was quietly having great relationship with the state of Israel, but publicly he was distancing himself from Israel in the 1970s. And the reason why he was doing this was because he knew that a large segment of the opposition to his government were anti-Israel, because unfortunately in the 1960s, in the ideology of the anti-Shah movement, anti-Americanism and anti-Israel had a symbiotic relationship. Yeah. They thought that anybody who is against America, by definition, should be against Israel. Now, why do they do that? I think part of it is because of this old ideology that we're fighting against the US and Israel is an ally of the United States. Part of it has to do with Islamic legitimacy. Iran wants to have the Islamic Republic, being a Shiite country, representing no more than 20% of the Islamic world. They want to attract the other 80%. And the way you do it is to come out as a defender of Palestinians who are Sunnis, and also, finally, as a way to undermine Iran's rival in the region, such as Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries, saying that you're not the defender, you're not the true defender of the Palestinians. We, Iranians, are the defender. But from the very beginning, I've said that, and that is not the position I've had now. I've said it all along, that it undermined Iranian national interest. Yes, ideologically, it helped the Islamic Republic. But sometimes what is good for the Islamic Republic is not good for Iran. And sometimes what is bad for the Islamic Republic is also bad for Iran. In the case of Israel, I think its policy has been bad for Iran and good for the Islamic Republic.
There you go. We have a couple, let me just give a couple of these from the online. This is a question about China. Do you see China as having any influence on US-Iran relations? And I would add to that, do you see Russia as having any influence on Iran-US relations?
Influence, yes, but not a great deal of influence. On the part of China, I think both China and Russia have vested interest in Iran, both economic and strategic, but I don't think they're going to play a decisive role. Although I think Russia's role is a little bit more important than China's role. China doesn't want to get too involved with Iran. It's like, you're my buddy, I love you, but I don't want to get married to you at this time. Russia is different, and they married Iran a long time ago, and as a result, Iran decided to divorce them. And now they're in the process that maybe they're going to go back. But ultimately, what Russia wants is an Iran that is very close to Russia, but is not close to the West. Yeah. And definitely not, they don't want to go back to the pre-1979 days. I think they would prefer a nuclear Iran to a pro-American Iran. Yeah. And for me, Iranian foreign policy must be based on the policy of having good relationship with the West, good relationship with the East. Iran cannot take side in this, in this developing world order. And I think if we can have nuclear negotiations to be followed by other type of negotiations, maybe then we can restore this balance. Without that equilibrium, hard days are ahead for Iran.
Yeah. Faye, you had a question? Wait for the microphone. 1 second.
Thank you. I'm Faye Moqtadir, a member of Stimson Center. Barbara, thank you so much for this amazing program, and thank you, Dr. Milani. My question to you is, since Trump came out of the JCPOA, he was the one he pulled out of the contract. I mean, what do Iranians have this time? What guarantee do they have that to come to the table to sign another agreement? And what are really the major demands of the United States? Because that agreement would have allowed them to the IAEA to check all the sites, and that would be a best way to curtail the Iranian nuclear program. But what do they want this time around? Thank you so much.
Well, Iran shouldn't trust the U.S., but nor should U.S. trust Iran. Trust but verify. That's, if my assumption of PSI is correct, and I believe it is, power, security, and interest. If that is the driving force for the Iranian foreign policy as well as for American foreign policy, they should not trust one another. However, there is the case of the U.S. getting out of the nuclear deal. And that is why I think, personally, that we can start negotiating over Iran's nuclear program and make some provisions that if both countries show reciprocity and honesty, then we can start negotiating about other issues. We need to build confidence between these two. The Iranians, obviously, the supreme leader, who never trusted the U.S. to begin with, never. As a matter of fact, one of his key differences with Hashemi Rafsanjani was over this issue. He accused Rafsanjani of trusting the U.S., and he used to tell him that the U.S. always comes to Iran for tactical purposes, but would never give us a strategic concession. So we have to come out with a way that the two sides can trust each other, confidence-building measures, and then if America delivers what it has promised, and if Iran delivers what it's promised, then we can go to the next level of negotiations, and I hope we do. I really hope that Iran enters into direct negotiations with the United States.
We have a viewer from Tehran, Dr. Mehdi Saram, who was a director at the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran, and he says, please talk about the Iranian nuclear program and why so far neither Israel or the U.S. has attacked Iranian nuclear facilities. I'll qualify this. The U.S. and Israel have attacked those facilities through cyber attacks and various acts of sabotage, but they have not as yet, of course, tried to destroy those facilities with bombs. Why do you think that is?
Well, I have a tough time explaining what Iran has been doing. Now he is asking me to explain why the United States and Israel haven't done certain things. I honestly, I prefer not to talk about this. I have my own reasons, but at this time, I prefer not to answer the question.
Okay. Well, I appreciate having a viewer from Iran. I imagine he's not the only one. This is an interesting question. This is, could Iran follow a model like India, strong and not aligned with a decent relationship with all?
Well, I suppose anything is possible. But for Iran, India is very different than the case of Iran. Much larger population, different kind of culture. For Iran, that's not possible because of its geostrategic location, because of a whole bunch other ideas. The Shah tried to side with one power against another. We had the 1979 revolution. The Islamic Republic has tried to side with the Russians and the Chinese against the US. It hasn't paid dividend because as long as Iran is prevented by the US to become part of the global economic system, the economic condition in Iran is not going to improve. It's that simple. It's not that complicated. It's very simple. There is one global economic system.
Well, you're speaking about it on a day when we're not sure there is a global economic system anymore. So,
No.
I mean, there's a lot of
Barbara,
uncertainty about these rules.
You can say that global system has been weakened or could change, but there is still one.
Yeah.
And Iran, as a country with huge natural resources, with the largest middle class in the region, with a history, a proud history, Iran is positioned to become a major economic power. And they cannot do it with the help of Russia and China unless they address their problems with Israel and the United States. But having said all of that, so the best policy for Iran is not being neutral. You can't. They are not going to allow Iran to be neutral. Iran is in a very dangerous, unstable region. Iran has to have good relationship with both Eastern countries, Russia, China, Europe, as well as the United States. My preference, of course, is that they tilt more toward the U.S.
Indeed. Yeah, Sina. Wait for the mic.
Sina usually doesn't need a mic.
Sorry. That's so the online people can hear.
Milani, thank you again. So going back to the Safavids, Qajar, Pahlavi, it seems to me that there is a theme of using one great power to fend off the pressure and the threat of another power. You know, the Safavids using, the Brits against the Portuguese, and then Qajar, Pahlavi, and now the Islamic Republic trying to use Russia and China to some extent to fend off the pressure of the United States. Now, if the regime changes, and we were just discussing about neutrality, having good relations with the both, how do you think, or how do you envision Iran's alliance choices if the regime changes? Because you're saying that Iran cannot be neutral, and it has to pick one side, preferably.
No, not one side, both sides.
You're saying both sides?
Yes.
Okay, so how do you envision Iran's alliance choices in that situation? Thank you.
Excellent question, Dr. Azadi. But the reality is that this idea of siding with one outside force against the dominant, which is called the third country strategy, has been an utter failure in Iranian history. Iran tried it briefly during the Napoleon time. It didn't pay any dividend to Iran. Reza Shah tried to use it with Germans. It didn't pay any dividend. The Shah tried to do it. It hasn't paid any dividend. Mohammad Mossadegh tried to use it, siding with America against the British. He ended up being overthrown in a coup. Iran cannot be passive. This idea of Iran is going to be a passive country is absolute nonsense. It's not going to happen because of its geography, because of the importance Iran has. Iran is a civilizational player. It's very different than being a country player. It's a civilizational player. And therefore, Iran has to be active. The question is, how active, on what basis, and with whom? My point is that with both. Balance it. Don't go against one against the other one. And I think if you look at the history, the Qajars somewhat succeeded in following that policy, which is one of the reasons why Iran was never colonized. And that's why the British and the Russians, who were the dominant power in 19th century Iran, really could not expand their influence so that Iran becomes at least a semi-colony of the rule. So balance and active participation in global system is what I think any regime would do. And as to future, what kind of regime we're going to have, I have absolutely no idea. And when something like this happens, which I don't expect anytime soon, but when it does happen, you and I can talk about this over dinner.
Well, I'm afraid we have many other questions, and they're all really good, but the hour has flown, as I knew that it would. Once again, people, Iran's Rise and Rivalry with the United States in the Middle East. It is an excellent book. Even if you think you're an expert, you will be surprised by what is in this really, really excellent work. So thank you for coming. Stay around for our next program if you like, and thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Mohsen. Thank you.
Thank you.
Really
Thank you.
appreciate it.
Thank you.